The heavy wooden door of the old storeroom had already clicked shut when Jed Stone stepped inside. For a searing second, he felt the heavy weight of accusation, as if he himself were the one who had fastened it. The air within was thick with the sun's baked heat and the dry scent of raw lumber. Light slipped through the cracks in the warped planks, cutting across the dirt floor in thin, golden threads. In the farthest corner, perched on a meager pile of discarded canvas, a woman sat, her knees pulled tight to her chest. She wore a torn work shirt that hung loose from one shoulder, barely reaching her thighs. Her legs were bare, marked with bruises in shades of yellow and dark purple that had not yet faded. When Jed's shadow crossed over her, she flinched, as if expecting the next blow to come from him. Jed stopped dead. Slowly, he removed his sweat-stained hat and held it against his chest. He didn't speak right away, his eyes sweeping across the cramped space. He saw the rusted iron shackle bolted into a heavy wall beam. He saw the short length of chain lying in the dust. He saw the crude lock on the outside of the door and knew at once it had been secured from beyond the storeroom. Then he saw her wrists. Red marks circled them, rubbed raw. The woman swallowed hard. Her lips trembled, but she forced the words out in a cracked whisper. "My father, 3 times a day." Her eyes shifted toward the thick support beam beside her. Jed followed her gaze. Scratched into the beam were 3 shallow cuts, clean and even. Not wild claw marks, not careless nicks, but 3 straight lines. Morning, midday, night. She did not cry. That was what struck him most. There were no tears left in her eyes, only a quiet, hollow waiting. "He drinks," she said softly. "Ah." And then he locks the door. Jed felt something shift deep in his chest. It wasn't just anger. It was shame. He had known Harley Vance for years, a small-time timber merchant who spent too much time at the Rattlesnake's Den in Serpent Creek, a man who laughed loud when he had a winning hand and blamed others when he lost. Harley had once told Jed that his daughter was sickly and hard to manage. Folks in Serpent Creek had whispered that Harley owed money, and that a piece of timber-rich land in his daughter's name might help clear his debts. What Jed saw in that storeroom was not sickness. It was control. The woman's name was Eliza May Vance. She was 28, old enough to speak for herself. But in Cactus Ridge County, a father's words still carried heavy weight, and daughters were expected to obey without question. Eliza watched Jed the way a trapped animal watches a man holding a rope, waiting to see which side he stood on. Outside, heavy boots crunched on the parched dirt. Harley Vance was coming back from the communal well. Jed's mind worked fast. If he walked away now, Eliza would count 3 more lines scratched into the beam before the sun went down. If he stepped between father and daughter, he would step into trouble. The law in Serpent Creek did not always favor women over fathers. Jed had once watched a drunk man break his own home apart. He had stayed quiet then. He had told himself it wasn't his business. He had hated himself for that silence ever since. He was not about to do it again. Harley stopped short when he saw Jed standing by the storeroom door. He set his metal pail down slowly and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He smiled, but the smile did not touch his eyes, which held the glint of sun on a drawn blade. She gets dramatic in this heat," Harley said lightly. "Womenfolk get a wild streak." Jed did not answer at once. He stepped just enough to block Harley's view into the storeroom. "She's locked in," Jed said, his voice calm, steady as a river stone. Harley shrugged, as if it meant nothing. "She runs off. I keep her close. That's called raising a child." Eliza stayed still behind Jed. She did not speak. She did not defend herself. She only watched. Jed had come to buy a bay mare. Instead, he had found this. "I'll take the mare," Jed said, his voice unwavering. "And I'll hire her for the drive back to my spread. I need help. I'll pay fair." Harley's smile faded like smoke in the wind. "She ain't for hire. She ain't livestock either," Jed replied. The words hung heavy between them, thick as a coming storm. Harley moved first. No warning, just a fist flying fast with the sour smell of stale whiskey on his breath. The punch hit Jed's shoulder, a dull thud. A second swing followed, wild and angry, but Jed caught him by the shirt and drove him back against the storeroom wall. The old planks groaned. Dust rose into the hot air. Harley fought like a cornered coyote. Jed fought steady, measured. One hard hit to the ribs. One shove that sent Harley stumbling into a salt licks barrel. Eliza moved then. She grabbed a handful of sawdust and threw it into her father's face. It was not brave in the way stories often tell. It was desperate, but it was enough. Jed reached for the iron key hanging on a rusty hook by the door. He unlocked the shackle and stepped between Harley and Eliza. "If I hear you lay a hand on her again," Jed said, low and firm, "I'll come back with the law, and I won't come alone." Minutes later, Jed's buckboard wagon rolled away from the Vance place. Eliza sat beside him, wrapped in a worn wool blanket coat he kept behind the seat. She stared straight ahead and did not look back. Behind them, Harley stood in the yard, his lip bleeding, his eyes cold and sharp. He was not thinking about fists anymore. He was thinking about the law. The buckboard wheels ground over the sun-baked dirt track as they left Serpent Creek behind. A winding tributary of the Rio Grande shimmered under the afternoon sun as they crossed at a shallow bend. Jed did not press Eliza with questions. He handed her an enamel mug of water and let silence sit between them, stretching like the endless plains. "You're safe here," he told her when his spread, the Lone Star Ranch, finally came into view. She nodded, but her eyes drifted toward the distant mesas, as if she still expected someone to come riding after them. That first evening, when the sun began to sink and shadows stretched long across the yard, Eliza stiffened. Jed noticed the way her shoulders tightened. He knew it was one of the hours she had scratched into that support beam. Morning, midday, night. Instead of speaking about it, Jed handed her a metal pail and asked her to help feed the horses. They moved from stall to stall together. The simple work filled the space between them. The moment passed without a locked door, without heavy boots stepping toward her. When the sky darkened and nothing happened, something small shifted inside her. Not trust, not yet, but maybe the start of it. The next morning, Jed rode into Serpent Creek and stepped into the marshal's office. Marshal Ben Carter sat behind his desk, boots resting on top, hat tipped back. He listened as Jed spoke, the details stark and unvarnished. He did not interrupt. "Locked storeroom," Jed said, "marks on her wrists. 3 times a day." Ben rubbed his jaw slowly. "Oh, Jedediah, you stepped into something all right," he said at last. "I know." Ben leaned forward, his expression grave. "Harley filed a complaint this morning. Says you kidnapped his daughter." The words settled heavy in the small, dusty room. "In Cactus Ridge County," Ben added carefully, "a father still carries weight." Jed understood what he meant. Blood often spoke louder than bruises out here. When Jed returned to the Lone Star Ranch that afternoon, Eliza stood by the wire fence, watching the road. She must have felt it before he saw it. Just before sunset, she spoke without turning around. "He won't stop," she whispered. Jed followed her gaze. Far down the dusty track that led from Serpent Creek, a thin line of dust was rising into the arid summer sky. The line of dust grew thicker as it moved closer, rising slow and steady against the pale New Mexico sky. Eliza did not run. She did not hide. She simply stood there with her hands resting on the fence rail, her face calm in a way that did not match the fear sitting deep in her eyes. Jed stepped forward until he stood slightly in front of her. He counted 3 riders. Harley rode in front. 2 men followed behind him, both from town, Jake and Red, the kind who spent more time leaning against saloon walls than mending fences. Their hats were pulled low, their faces hard. No badge in sight. The riders pulled up sharp in the yard. Dust rolled past them and settled around the porch steps. "You got something that belongs to me," Harley called out, his voice loud, but there was something tight under it, something that did not sound fully sure. "She ain't something," Jed answered, steady and calm. One of the men, Jake, spat into the dirt. "This don't need to turn ugly," he said, though his hand rested close to his belt. Eliza stepped out onto the porch behind Jed. She stayed close, but she did not hide behind him. That mattered. Harley saw it. For a brief moment, his face changed. Not anger, not fear. Control slipping. "You think he'll keep you?" Harley snapped at Eliza, his voice a venomous hiss. "You think this rancher wants your trouble?" Eliza did not answer. Her hands tightened into fists at her sides. Jed kept his eyes on Harley. You filed a complaint. Marshal Ben knows where she is. We can ride into Serpent Creek and settle this the right way. Harley gave a short laugh that held no humor, a dry rattle in his throat. Settle it here, he said and swung down from his horse. It happened fast. Harley shoved Jed hard in the chest. One of the other men, Red, tried to step around toward the porch. Jed moved before Red could reach the steps. He drove his shoulder into Harley, knocking him back into the dirt. The two hired men circled, but neither drew a gun. This was not about bullets yet. It was about pride. Harley swung wild. His fist caught Jed along the jaw. Jed staggered once, then steadied. He answered with one clean punch that split Harley's lip. Blood ran down into the dust. Eliza's voice cut through the tense air. Stop. It was not a scream. It was strong, clear, like a bell echoing in the canyons. The second man, Red, froze when she grabbed a wire fence post and stepped forward, her chin lifted. There was no shackle on her wrist now, no locked door behind her. Harley lay flat on his back, his chest rising fast. He stared up at the vast New Mexico sky for a moment before speaking. You don't understand, he muttered. Jed stood over him, breathing hard. Then explain. Harley pushed himself up slowly, wiping blood from his mouth. She signed it. The words made the yard go still, every sound swallowed by the dry air. Signed what? Jed asked, his voice sharp. Harley's eyes flicked toward Eliza, just for a second. That was all it took. Eliza swallowed. He made me sign something, she said quietly. Now the two hired men shifted where they stood, a new uncertainty in their stances. This was no longer about a runaway daughter. This was about paper, about land, and land in New Mexico territory could turn neighbors into enemies faster than a bad hand of poker. Harley climbed back into his saddle, his face contorted. We'll let the law sort it, he said, his voice low and tight with suppressed fury. You want law? You'll get it. The three riders turned and headed back toward Serpent Creek, a line of dust rising behind them once more. Eliza stood still until they disappeared from sight, the dust cloud shrinking to nothing on the horizon. Only then did her shoulders drop. What did he make you sign? Jed asked gently. She looked down at her hands, still clenched. My mother's land, the river parcel. Jed felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. Land along the Rio Grande tributary was worth more than Harley's timber claims, more than his ramshackle cabin. Ow, Jed asked, his voice barely a whisper. He said if I didn't sign, he'd lock me in there and never let me out, she said. 3 times a day until I did. Her voice did not shake. That scared Jed more than tears would have. The next morning, they rode into Serpent Creek together. The town felt heavier than usual. People watched from storefronts and dusty porches as they passed. News traveled fast in places like this, faster than horses. Inside the marshal's office, Ben Carter stood by his desk. Harley was already there, his lips swollen and purple. His pride, however, seemed untouched. Ben laid a folded vellum deed on the desk between them. A transfer of land, Ben said, his voice flat. From Eliza May Vance to Harley Vance. He looked at Eliza. Did you sign this? Yes, she answered, her voice quiet but firm. Did you sign it freely? The room went quiet. Even Harley held his breath. Eliza lifted her chin. No. One word, clear and steady. Harley stepped forward, a snarl on his face. She's my daughter. It's family business. Ben's face hardened, his eyes like flint. A locked storeroom ain't family business. Harley's jaw tightened. You going to take a woman's word over her father's? Ben did not answer right away. He looked at the red marks still faintly visible around Eliza's wrists. He looked at Jed standing beside her, not speaking for her, only present, a silent pillar. In this county, Ben said slowly, a father has rights. But he don't have shackles. Harley tried to argue. He spoke about discipline, about a wayward daughter, about a woman who ran wild. Eliza did not interrupt. She simply stood there, unmoving, letting his words fall flat. Ben finally nodded toward one of his deputies. Take him. Harley's face turned pale for just a moment before anger covered it again. "This ain't over," he snarled as they led him away. By sundown, the story had spread from the rattlesnake's den to the mission steps. Some folks said Jed had done right. Others muttered that a man had the right to raise his own child. But the vellum deed was set aside for review, and Harley Vance sat behind bars for holding his daughter against her will. That night, back at the Lone Star Ranch, Eliza stood near the wire fence again. The sky burned orange and red above the distant mesas before fading into deep blue. "It was always at sunset," she said softly. Now, Jed knew what she meant. One of the 3 times. They waited together. The last light faded, painting the horizon in shades of purple and gray. The wind moved through the tall, dry grass. No one came. No boots crunched on the crushed stone. No key turned in a lock. Eliza let out a slow breath. For the first time since Jed had seen her in that storeroom, her eyes filled with tears. "I thought no one would ever believe me," she said, her voice a fragile whisper. Jed rested his forearms on the fence beside her. "Sometimes," he said, his gaze fixed on the darkening sky, "it only takes one person to stand up." She looked at him then, not as a trapped animal watching a rope, but as someone starting to believe the rope had been cut. Still, deep inside, Jed knew this was not finished. Harley was not the kind of man to let go easy, and Serpent Creek had a way of changing its mind when money and land were involved. Out in the dark, far beyond the ranch lights, a single rider moved along the road, watching and waiting. The rider did not come through the front gate. He stopped far enough from the ranch house to stay hidden by the deep shadows of the mesquite trees. Jed saw the faint shape of horse and man against the distant, jagged line of the horizon. He did not reach for his rifle. He simply watched. Eliza stood beside him on the porch. She felt it too, that chilling sense of being measured from a distance. "Is it him?" she asked quietly, her voice barely a breath. "No," Jed said after a moment. "Harley's still in a cell." The rider turned his horse slowly and disappeared back down the dusty track. But the message had been sent. This was not over. 2 days later, word came from Serpent Creek. Harley had posted bond. Money had changed hands, and men who owed him favors had spoken up. The vellum deed was being reviewed, but it was not yet void. There would be a hearing, and the circuit judge would decide. Eliza listened without blinking, her face a mask of resolve. "He'll lie," she said. "Then you tell the truth," Jed answered. On the morning of the hearing, Serpent Creek filled early. Buckboard wagons lined the main street, horses tied to every hitching post. The rattlesnake's den was quieter than usual, the saloon piano silent. Even the card tables felt the weight of it. Inside the small courthouse, the air was warm and still. Men removed their hats. Women whispered behind gloved hands. Harley stood on one side of the room in a clean shirt and a stiff coat. The bruise on his lip had faded to yellow. He looked calm, almost confident. Eliza stood on the other side with Jed beside her. She wore a plain calico dress Mrs. Gable, Jed's neighbor, had given her. The red marks on her wrists had faded, but they were not gone. The judge, a stern man with spectacles perched on his nose, listened as Harley spoke first. He talked about a stubborn daughter, about discipline, about land meant to stay in the family. He said she had signed freely, that she had been confused and influenced by an outsider. He did not once mention the storeroom. When it was Eliza's turn, the room felt smaller, the silence pressing in. She stepped forward alone, her spine straight. "Did you sign this paper?" the judge asked. "Yes." "Were you forced?" Eliza did not rush her answer. "He locked me in the storeroom," she said, her voice clear and strong. 3 times a day, morning, midday, night. He kept a shackle on the wall. He said I would stay there until I signed. A murmur moved through the room, a collective intake of breath. Harley shifted where he stood, his calm facade cracking. The judge leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "Why did you not speak sooner?" Eliza's voice stayed steady, unwavering. "Because I was afraid no one would believe me." Silence followed that, heavy and real, filling every corner of the small room. Then Jed stepped forward, not to speak over her, but to add what he had seen. He described the iron shackle bolted into the wall beam, the heavy chain in the dust, the 3 lines scratched into the support. He did not raise his voice. He did not exaggerate. He simply told the truth, stark and undeniable. Marshal Ben Carter confirmed the red marks on her wrists when he first saw her in town. He confirmed the locked storeroom. Harley's confidence began to crack, his face paling under the tan. "You got no proof. I forced her," Harley said sharply, his voice rising in panic. "She's my daughter." The judge looked at Eliza again, his gaze unwavering. "Did you sign because you wanted to give him the land?" "No," she said. One word, strong and final. The judge sat back in his chair, a decisive thump. "A signature given under threat is no signature at all," he said firmly, his voice echoing in the sudden quiet. "The transfer is void." The room broke into low voices, some relieved, some angry, a buzzing hive of reactions. And as for the confinement, the judge continued, his eyes fixing on Harley. "This court does not accept shackles as discipline." Harley's face drained of color entirely. He was fined heavily and ordered to stay away from Eliza May Vance. The land remained in her name. For the first time, the law had not chosen blood over truth. Outside the courthouse, Eliza stepped into the harsh sunlight and stopped. She looked up at the wide New Mexico sky. No storeroom roof above her, no warped planks blocking the light. "It's over," Jed said quietly. She shook her head once. "It's starting." Back at the Lone Star Ranch, the days moved slower and steadier. Eliza worked beside Jed in the fields. She learned the rhythm of the land, planting, watering, mending fence lines under the blistering sun. The first time sunset came without fear, she did not notice at first. She was laughing at something one of the ranch hands had said, a genuine, unfettered sound. Then she stopped and looked west. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in fiery hues. No locked door, no boots on crushed stone, no key turning. Tears filled her eyes, but this time they were not from pain. They were from the quiet, profound relief of a dam finally breaking. Weeks passed. One afternoon, a letter arrived from a lawyer in Santa Fe. Harley had sold what little he had left to pay debts and fines. He was leaving Cactus Ridge County. Some said he was headed south. Others said west. No one cared much where. Eliza stood by the wire fence again, the same place she had once watched for dust rising in fear. Now she watched cattle move slow across the field, and she felt the wind in her hair, untamed and free. "I used to count the marks," she said softly to Jed. "Every day I thought that was my life." Jed leaned against the old wooden support beam, the one from the broken storeroom, now standing near the barn. It had been brought there as firewood, but never burned. The 3 scratched lines were still visible, faint but present. "You don't have to count anymore," he said. Eliza walked over to the post. She ran her fingers over the cuts. Then she picked up a mallet resting on a barrel nearby. Without hesitation, she struck the post once, twice, 3 times. The wood split down the middle with a sharp crack. The marks were gone, destroyed. That evening, as the sky turned gold and then deep blue over the sprawling land, Eliza sat on the porch steps. She did not stiffen. She did not brace for pain. She simply breathed deep and full. Jed sat a few feet away, giving her space, but not leaving. "You didn't have to help me," she said after a long silence, the words barely audible. "Yes, I did," he answered, his voice low. She looked at him then, her eyes searching his. "Why?" Jed thought about that scorching summer afternoon in the storeroom, about the shackle, about the way she had not cried, her quiet resolve. "Because I stayed quiet once before," he said, "and I won't do that again." The wind moved through the tall grass, a soft sigh across the plains. Crickets began to sing their nightly chorus. Eliza smiled, a small, genuine curve of her lips. Small but real. "3 times a day," she said softly, looking out at the open land, now hers. "That's how often he tried to break me. But it only took once for someone to stand between us." The ranch lights glowed warm against the gathering dark. No dust rose on the road. No rider watched from the shadows. The clock that had once ruled her life was gone. Not because time changed, but because fear no longer dictated its turning.